Okay, well, welcome everyone to this third segment of the Discovering Japanese-Canadian Nikkei Identity and Culture virtual conference. So we are still waiting for one speaker at the moment, so I'm just going to start with a few introductions, and then hopefully Jack will be able to join us in a bit. So before I start, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that where I am at Athabasca University, we are on the traditional lands of the Indigenous people, the Inuit, First Nations, and Métis of Canada. We honor the ancestry, heritage, and the gifts of the Indigenous peoples and give them thanks. My name is Dr. Henry TSANG. I'm an assistant professor of architecture at Athabasca University. I am based in Calgary in Alberta, and I am also the president of the University of Tokyo Alumni Association in Canada. I completed my PhD at the University of Tokyo in 2006 and lived in Japan. I am, however, a Canadian born from parents from Hong Kong and Indonesia. And my wife is Japanese, and together we are raising a little Nikkei baby boy. His name is Issei. I will be your host tonight and this morning, Ohayo gozaimasu to everyone in Japan, and the moderator of this event. Sorry, I'm just checking on the email. Jack just sent me an email and he's joining us right now. Hi, Jack. So moving on, today's event is brought to you today by the University of Tokyo Alumni Association West Chapter. And I'm just gonna show a couple of slides before we move on to our main presentations. The slides. So today's event is brought to you by the University of Tokyo Alumni Association West Chapter. The board is based in Vancouver and Calgary. Today we have Amy Avermed and Yukiya Saito, who are two of our board directors who will be assisting me in today's session. Given the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, university students were not able to travel to study abroad this year. So the University of Tokyo Alumni Association is organizing this event as a hands-on activity program to give students a little bit of a Canadian experience while learning a bit about a piece of Japanese history, which is little known to most Japanese people, but also inviting fellow Canadians to also discover a little bit about our past as well. So welcome everyone to Canada. If you're from Japan, Canada e yokoso. Also, I would like to thank Athabasca University for providing us this venue, the technology platform for today's event. Support was also provided by the Japan Foundation in Toronto, as well as the Calgary Japanese Community Association. So thank you very much. We have also collaborated with 4 Japanese universities who have introduced this program to their students. So I'd like to welcome again everyone tuning in from the Kyoto University of Foreign Studies, Doshisha University in Kyoto, Wakayama University, and the University of Tokyo. So today's theme is discovering Japanese-Canadian Nikkei identity and culture, past and present. And we are very fortunate to have invited an amazing panel of Nikkei storytellers today to talk to you about their lived experiences on this topic. So I'd like to introduce you to our three speakers, starting from the right. So first we have Mary Kitagawa. Mary was born on Salt Spring Island, British Columbia, but did not grow up there due to being uprooted with her family by the Canadian government in 1942. She graduated from Cardston High School in Alberta and went on to graduate from Trinity College and University of Toronto. She received her secondary school teaching diploma from UBC, the University of British Columbia, which enabled her to teach at Kitsilano Secondary School. She has been married to her husband Tosh for 60 years. Together they have a son, a daughter, 5 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren. In addition to that, amongst her many achievements, she has, in 2011, Mary had successfully advocated for UBC to give the 76 Japanese Canadian students who were forced out of UBC following the attack on Pearl Harbor honorary degrees. She has many also achievements and received many awards, which I won't be able to list here alone. I just found out from Vivian that she will be also receiving a special award tomorrow from the Japanese government. So congratulations, Mary. She wishes also to acknowledge that they are living as guests on the traditional territory on the Sawasan First Nation and the unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nations. Welcome, Mary, to today's event. Second, we have Ms. Vivian Wakabayashi, RYGNESTAD. She was a teacher and principal for many years, and she is now retired. She is the past president of the British Columbia Retired Principals and Vice Principals Association. She was honored to be one of the University British Columbia's outstanding alumni from the Faculty of Education in 2015. For the past 7 years, she has been the chair of the Community Council to the Landscapes of Injustice Research Project. The Community Council is a small group of Japanese Canadians acting in an advisory role to the researchers. Welcome, Vivian. Thirdly, we have with us Mr. Jack Kobayashi. Jack Kobayashi was born in Montreal in 1963 and now lives in Whitehorse, Yukon. During the Second World War, Jack's mother's family was interned at Tashmi, and his dad's family ended up in Blind Bay at a self-supporting site, struggling through various hardships to make ends meet. His father, Bill Kobayashi, was the president of the Toronto National Association of Japanese Canadians when redress was won. So Jack is also an architect, as and myself, and his interest in architecture sprung from his childhood desire to become a police officer and his love of drawing. A floor plan drawn for a police station sparked an interest in architecture, as did exposure to the architect Raymond Moriyama's work, who designed the Ontario Science Centre during frequent family summer trips to Toronto. So Jack is the founder of Kobayashi and Zeta Architects, which was founded in 1993, and is the largest architecture firm operating out of Northern Canada. The firm is much acclaimed, having won the Professional Prix de Rome in architecture by the Canadian Council for Arts, 3 British Columbia Lieutenant Government Awards for Architecture, and also a 2012 Canadian Architect Award of Excellence. So welcome, Jack. Just want to make sure, Jack, are you online right now?
Yes, I am. I just had a bit of trouble there.
Okay, great. Well, welcome, Jack. So I will be moderating the session today, and As an account of my own Nikkei story, I just want to show you a couple of photos of my own, and then we'll move into the different stories from our panelists. My Nikkei story is that I graduated from university at McGill University in Montreal, and then I received a Monbu Kagakusho scholarship to study at the University of Tokyo. And here you see some photos of that time. I lived in Japan for 10 years after that, working for a Japanese architecture firm called Nihon Sekkei. Eventually, I got married to a Japanese woman, my current wife, Yukari, and here you see some photos of our wedding, and decided to return to Canada to raise a family. These are some of the photos of when I was in Japan working for the Japanese International Cooperation Agency. During that time, that's when also the earthquake happened in 2011. And here are some photos during a trip, youth leadership trip with Shinzo Abe, and some photos of my current life with the Calgary Japanese, the CJC, the Calgary Japanese Community Association, where I am a Yosakoi dancer, as well as currently working on a design for a new community center, as you see here on the right. We now have our own little Nikkei baby, and his name is Issei, with the word first star. And being a member of the local Japanese community in Calgary, we are now heavily involved with the activities here. My family and my projects have led me to try to better understand Nikkei in terms of its identity and culture, and question how can Japanese Canadian and Nikkei culture and identity be defined. So I am happy with today we may find some clues and hear from 3 amazing Nikkei stories from our panelists. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our first speaker, Mary, if you could share your story with us, and I'll pass you the mic. The stage is.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this session. I would like to say I am a guest of the Tuasan First Nations and the Musqueam people. The story I'm going to tell you is a Canadian story, of course, because I was born here. So I'll begin. The Canada that greeted my grandfather in 1896 was not a friendly place for Asians. There were many racist laws passed by the BC legislature that made it difficult for them to progress in a normal way. One of the most egregious laws was the amended Provincial Elections Act of 1895. It stated, "No Chinaman, Japanese, or Indians shall have his name placed on the register of voters for any electoral district to be entitled to vote in any election." This act denied all non-white people the right to practice in any professions such as law, engineering, accounting, medicine, nursing, and so on. It also made it illegal for people of color to buy crown land, although they could buy from private people. Non-whites were doomed to work only in the primary industry, which were farming, fishing, logging, and mining. Graduating at the top of the class from the University of British Columbia did not enable a non-white student to practice in the professions they were trained in. In the 1930s, the RCMP and the military were keeping surveillance of all Japanese Canadian communities. They reported to the government in 1940 that Canadians of Japanese descent were hardworking, law-abiding, and loyal citizens. Yet, 8 months before the Pacific War began, Japanese Canadians over the age of 16 were forced to register with the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They had to carry an identification card which had their thumbprint, photo, physical descriptions, occupation, serial number, and signature on it. There were 3 categories: buff-colored card for Japanese nationals, white-colored card for Canadian-born, and pink cards for naturalized citizens. If one did not carry these cards with them and was stopped by the RCMP officer, you could spend up to 6 months in jail. My Canadian-born mother's card should have been white, but because she was married to a national, they said she was no longer born in Canada. The all-powerful War Measures Act was invoked in 1942 by Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King without going through Parliament. This enabled the government to act without discussion or debate. The result was a lightning-swift effort to deal with the Japanese Canadians. On the eve of December the 7th, many men were snatched away from their families while having their dinner. They were imprisoned in the immigration building, which used to be at the foot of Thurlow Street in Vancouver. Later, these men were sent to the prisoner of war camp in KITAGAWA or Angler, Ontario. On December the 8th, 1941, 1,200 fishing boats were impounded and taken to Anniville Dike on the Fraser River in North Delta. The BC politicians believed that the Japanese Canadian fishermen were spies and would aid the Japanese military if they arrived on the BC coast. The BC politicians had a maniacal hatred of people of Japanese descent. Perhaps it was because they felt threatened by the successes achieved by them. One of the most virulently racist BC member of Parliament, Ian Alistair Mackenzie, said, "It is this government's plan to get these people out of BC as fast as possible. It is my personal intention, as long as I remain in public life, to see that they never come back here. Let our slogan be for British Columbia, no Japs from the Rockies to the seas." Final decision to uproot the 22,000 people of Japanese race was made at the January the 8th and 9th, 1942 conference in Ottawa. It was called the Japanese Problem. There were many BC politicians led by Ian Mackenzie attending who were determined to get their way, saying the Japanese Canadians were a security risk. In Lieutenant General Maurice Polk's book, Soldiers and Politicians, a memoir, he wrote, "When I agreed with the RCMP and the military that the Japanese Canadians posed no threat to the security of the nation, all hell broke loose. I was afraid that the BC politicians were going to charge across the table to manhandle me. The rage was a sight to behold." One BC delegate conceded privately to him that the war afforded a heaven-sent opportunity to rid themselves of the Japanese economic menace forevermore. Lieutenant General Polk understood then that this exercise had nothing to do with security. He said he left that meeting feeling dirty all over. Another delegate, Escott Reed, who was the assistant to the External Affairs, wrote in his book, Radical Mandarin, the memoirs of Escott Reed. They spoke of the Japanese Canadians in the way the Nazis would have spoken about Jewish Germans. When they spoke, I felt in that committee room the physical presence of evil. This was the Canada we lived in. So please join me as I relive my family's cruel journey through the uprooting, dispossession, incarceration, imprisonment, and enslavement by the Democratic Government of Canada after the Pacific War began. I was born on Salt Spring Island, BC, and was 7 years old in 1941. My mother was born in Steveston, British Columbia. My father was born in Hiroshima, Japan, and came to Canada in 1927. I had 3 sisters and a baby brother, all born on Salt Spring Island. My youngest brother, who was born in the prison camp in 1944, died in 2008. Both of my older sisters have now passed away. Our family history in Canada began in 1896 when my maternal grandfather, Kumanosuke Okano, came to Canada as a young man 125 years ago. He was followed by my grandmother, Rio Kimura, in 1903. They became fishers when my mother was born. In order to be fishers, they had to be naturalized. Their successes in fishing enabled them to own 5 large boats. However, when the white and the native fishers began to complain about the successes of the Japanese-Canadian fishers, the government began to take the license away from the Japanese-Canadian fishers. My grandparents were one of the first to lose theirs. They sold their boats and bought 200 acres of prime land on Salt Spring Island and began farming. By 1941, after 4 years of hard work, they were retired. Across the road, my parents, Katsuyori and Kimiko Okano Murakami, carved out a productive 7-acre farm. They hired Japanese-Canadian women from Vancouver Island to help with the harvest in the spring and summer months. Father built a dormitory to accommodate them. Mother hired babysitters to look after us children. Our parents provided us with a very happy, carefree life. When the war began, our lives changed forever. We were now labeled as enemy aliens and lost our freedoms. The trauma that still lives me was watching the RCMP officers speeding into our property to arrest my father. The officer roughly pushed him onto the back of the pickup truck where my father fell on his stomach. He got up quickly to reassure us that he was all right. As the truck sped away, my sisters and I ran after the truck crying, "Daddy, Daddy, come back." We chased the truck until it disappeared out of sight. With tears flooding our eyes, we ran back to Mother, who was where we left her, clutching tightly to my baby brother. I am sure that every cell in her body must have been exploding with pain. She was now a reluctant single parent, responsible for her 5 children, the farm, and 5,000 egg-laying hens. My 13-year-old sister Alice was mature, much beyond her age. She leaped into Father's empty shoes and took over his tasks. She and my other sister and I were not allowed to go to school or church because it was dangerous to leave our property. Alice was stoned after school by boys and came home bloodied from head down to her legs. An agent of the custodian of enemy property came to see my mother. He wanted her to sign the document that said that our property would be kept in trust until our return after the war. Mother signed because she trusted this fellow, because she knew him since he was a lad. He instructed my mother to get rid of the chickens and leave everything as is, because he will look after them. There were 77 Japanese Canadians living on Salt Spring Island. 7 men were snatched away with my father. On April the 21st, 1942, we were loaded onto a ship called the Princess Mary and sent to Vancouver, where we were forced to live in an animal barn in Hastings Park. The pungent smell of urine and feces assaulted our nostrils. There were thousands of metal bunk beds crammed close together. Our mattresses were bags stuffed with straw. Each bunk had 2 army blankets, but no sheets. In order to seek some privacy, women hung whatever they could on the railings. Our toilet was the gutter that once washed away animal waste. We were fed poor, unpalatable food in the poultry section of the barn. Many people got food poisoning and diarrhea. Many elderly women separated from their husbands and families were constantly sobbing. The men and boys over the age of 12 were housed in the forum. We were worried about our elderly grandfather because he was all alone among strangers. After 2.5 weeks, we bid farewell to our grandparents and transported to Greenwood in the interior of BC. There we learned that father was still alive and being forced to work building roads in Yellowhead near Banff, Alberta. After several months, he was told that if he took his family to a sugar beet farm, either in Alberta or Manitoba, we could be reunited as a family. Life on the sugar beet farm in McGrath, Alberta was comparable to being a slave. We lived in a 10 by 15 feet empty box next to a pig pen. The hut had no cooking facilities or beds. Our water source was a pond that we shared with the animals, and the food came out of cans because my mother had no stove. Father worked daily for the farmer, but became weaker as the months passed. My parents realized that if we continued to live like this, we would certainly all die. A request was sent to the commissioner of the Security Commission in Lethbridge, Alberta, to free us from this untenable situation. He agreed to send us to one of the incarceration camps situated along the east side of Slocan Lake. With an RCMP escort, we arrived in Popoff at the end of October. After a while, we were moved to Bay Farm and then sent to live in a tent in Slocan. On January 1, 1943, we were moved to Roseberry, situated at the northern end of Slocan Lake. The shacks were unfinished, so it felt like we were living in a basket. The cold winter air kept seeping in from between the boards on the wall, on the walls, which were wrapped with tar paper. The tiny tin stove could not compete with the cold coming in. There was neither piped water nor electricity, just 6 candles to light up the night. While in Roseberry, Order in Council 469 was passed by the federal government, nullifying the document that my mother signed for the agent of the custodian of enemy property. Our property and all that we owned was sold without my parents' consent. The small amount of money from the sale was deposited in our frozen bank account. My parents had no control of their own money. A small amount was doled out to us to keep us alive. Even when my youngest brother was born in Roseberry, they would not give my mother a penny more for diapers and clothes for him. We paid for our own imprisonment. We lived there until 1945, when we were given an ultimatum: move east of the Rockies or be deported to Japan. This was the beginning of the second uprooting. We chose to stay in Canada, so we were moved to New Denver, 5 miles south of Roseberry. The war had ended in August of that year, but we were still not freed. After a year in New Denver, we were moved back to another dreaded sugar beet farm in McGrath. Staying in BC was not an option. We suffered through another 3 years on 2 different farms. When we moved to run a restaurant in Cardston, Alberta, 35 miles south from McGrath, our family struggled for 5 years to rescue a restaurant started by my uncle. We were able to save enough money to move back to Salt Spring Island after 12 years in exile. Perhaps I could tell you what happened to us upon our return to the island during Q&A. It was not just the properties that we lost. The intangible losses were ones we could not recover. We lost our community, our dreams, our education, our friends, our freedom, our retirement, our intergenerational passage of wealth, the most productive years of our lives, like that of my parents, our childhood, our secure family lives when our families were forcibly separated, etc. My parents were a powerful team. They were our role models. They taught us never to quietly accept a cruel onslaught of racial hatred, never to act as victims, and always show a proud face to the world, never a face of defeat. They showed us how to be generous and compassionate toward the other people. They provided security and created opportunities for us. They believed strongly in education and allowed 4 of us to attend university. Throughout their lives, they were truly honorable and loyal citizens of Canada. With dignity and courage, our parents brought the family safely through some terrible, terrible times in our journey through life and ensured that our family prevailed. So thank you.
Thank you, Mary, for your that very heartfelt story. I'd like to ask the students to wait until the end to ask the questions. Then let's move on to our next speaker, Vivian, if you could turn on your camera and start telling your story.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Henry. My family's story is just like many Japanese Canadians. No one family has the same story as everyone else, but if you listen, you'll hear the same theme of racism and courage that has gone through the histories. My family's history in Canada began in 1897 with the arrival of my WAKABAYASHI grandfather. He was a fisherman before starting up his own business in Vancouver, making tofu. My Kobayashi grandfather arrived in 1907, and he worked at various jobs, and finally he was able to buy land for a vegetable farm. Now we'll jump to 1907. As Mary has said, there was virulent racism towards Asians. A large anti-Asian mob raided Vancouver's Chinatown and Japantown. Businesses, buildings, homes, residences were damaged. Both personal and institutional racism in BC continued. And as Mary alluded to, you may be educated, but you were denied to be in the professions. However, for teachers, qualified teachers of Japanese ancestry were able to teach, but they were only able to teach other Japanese Canadians. In 1908, to limit the number of Asian immigrants, a head tax was imposed on those from China. I've often wondered why there was no head tax imposed on immigrants from Japan. It turns out that Britain needed a foothold, an ally in Asia, and they had formed diplomatic ties with Japan. The Canadian government wanted to impose a head tax on the Japanese immigrants, but Britain at that time that ruled Canada was denied by Britain. The head tax was denied by Britain. Instead, the Hayashi-Lemieux Gentleman's Agreement was signed in 1908 that restricted immigration from Japan to 400 men a year. Women and children were allowed to come. This agreement was intended in order for Japan to save face while enabling Britain to maintain ties with Japan. Racism towards Japanese Canadians continued to grow. Japanese Canadians were seen as an economic threat, mainly in the areas of fishing, farming, and forestry. Many were landowners. Many Japanese Canadians had established thriving businesses. As Mary has said, research has uncovered documentation that proves that many in the BC government, as well as those with influence, wanted all Asians out of BC. Keep BC white. This is British Columbia. Racism, a family story. 1941, my mother was a young, happy woman living in the Kitsilano area of Vancouver. She was a city girl. She was living with her parents. She had a boyfriend who became my father. She was working, had friends. She had a good life, she thought, except for the racism that her parents had warned her about. She knew of the curfew. She knew she had to carry her identification, but life was generally good for her. One day, she and her friends decided to go to a movie. They got onto a bus to go downtown to Vancouver. As they got off the bus, a small group of well-dressed, middle-aged white women were waiting to get on. Suddenly, seeing my mother and her friends, they began shouting, "Japs, Japs, get out of here. Go back to your own country. We don't want you here. Get out of here." My mother stopped, but suddenly she felt a big gob of spit hit her cheek. Stunned, my young mother stood there with the spit running down her face, realizing that the racism was real. And the hatred is based not on the fact that she was Japanese, she was Canadian, but she looked Japanese, she was Japanese. She had been warned by her parents about the racism, but she suddenly realized that it was true. It was against everyone. It was because of her ancestry. When Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, many people blamed the start of the racism or the anger towards Japanese Canadians on Pearl Harbor. No, it wasn't that. It was the Canadian government and the BC government that made the decisions that horrified Japanese Canadians. When it happened, immediately 1,200 Japanese-owned fishing boats along the BC coast were rounded up and confiscated. Japanese language schools and newspapers were closed. Insurance policies were canceled. Cameras, radios, and other communication devices were confiscated. Now, countries cannot intern their own citizens. Therefore, Canada declared that anyone with Japanese ancestry was now called an enemy alien. 1942, the BC government declared that the area of up to 160 kilometers from the coastline was to be a protected zone and cleared of everyone of the Japanese ancestry. This was supposedly because they had been suspected of or were disloyal to Canada. Not true. Canada's military and police objected, saying that Japanese Canadians were not a security risk. 75 Japanese Canadian students were expelled from UBC. 22,000 people of Japanese ancestry were forcibly uprooted from their homes. More than 75% were Canadian citizens. This happened to Canadian citizens. The War Measures Act was enforced. Japanese Canadians lost their rights of citizenship, their civil rights, and the government was given unlimited power without being challenged in courts. Canadians were incarcerated, Japanese Canadians. They had lost their rights to move about freely. They were incarcerated. Men were rounded up and taken to road camps to build BC's highways, or they were sent to prisoner of war camps. The women and children could stay behind. The promise was if the men went, the women and children could stay and they would be fine. Not so. Suddenly, sometimes with as little as 24 hours or just no notice, men were rounded up and they were gone, but women and children were rounded up and they could take with them only what they could carry. The rest, the government promised the rest of all the things that they left behind, their businesses, their homes, their vehicles, their dishes, all their possessions, would be kept in the protective custody of the custodian of enemy properties. A promise was made. Women and children were taken from their homes and forced to live in the former horse barns in Vancouver's Hastings Park. My mother remembers that they had no beds. They put blankets over straw. Sheets were hung for privacy. The stench of horse manure and urine was still in the air. One woman I interviewed was 13 when she got the measles when she was incarcerated at Hastings Park. Along with other children with measles, they were quarantined. Where were they quarantined? Under the floor of the barn where coal used to be stored. That's where the children with measles were placed. She was then in charge of caring for the younger children. There were 4 other younger children who also had the measles. Food was handed to them and they couldn't leave their dungeon under the floor until the spots were gone. No one knew for how long they would be away from home. Suddenly they were put on trains to internment camps and housing that was hastily constructed, or just they were given tents. Life was cold and difficult. Looting and theft was rampant after the Japanese Canadians were removed from their homes. Families later discovered that the inventories made by the custodian of enemy properties were missing. Items like boats, vehicles, furniture, dishes, pianos had gone missing. In 1948, 1 year later, the war ended, World War II ended in 1945, but for Japanese Canadians, they did not get their freedom until 1949. At that time, Japanese Canadians asked for the money that had been put into a bank account, a frozen bank account in their name, when all their homes and possessions had been sold without permission. Research shows that everything had been sold for a fraction, a tiny fraction of their actual value. And then the remaining money in their bank account had been used to pay for their transportation to the internment camps and for the cost of their stay. 1949, Japanese Canadians were finally free to go home. Home? Where was home? Where were they supposed to go to? There was nothing to go back to. Where should they go? My family was a bit different from others. They didn't go to an internment camp. In 1942, my parents married. And a few months later, my father was sent to a road camp to work. But later, unlike many other Japanese Canadian families, instead of being forcibly removed to an internment camp, my parents, along with their parents, some siblings and other families, moved to a self-supporting site in the interior of BC. Their task was to help build and run a small sawmill. They were under the guardianship of a man who promised them work and a place to live if they would work at his small sawmill. A guardian was appointed, and the guardian and the local police ensured that they didn't leave their area of residence without permission. In the beginning, the men's pay was not money. Their pay was milled lumber, lumber that they had milled to build their homes. Homes sounds quite nice, but they weren't. Their homes were small shacks of wood and tar paper, no insulation, plastic for windows, but they did have a wooden door and a small stove for cooking. When I was born a year later, my mother said she worried that I would freeze to death because the newly milled lumber had shrunk and gaps were constantly forming. On the road into the small town near where we were living, there were signs everywhere, numerous signs that said, "No Japs allowed." No Japs allowed. Where were we to buy groceries? My father went to the owner of a small store near where we were living. The owners, despite much disagreement from the local people, agreed to let them buy groceries. The owner had to deal with the people who lived in the area, persuade them by saying, "They're Canadians. This war is not their fault. How can they live? Where will they buy groceries?" I much later discovered that most of the people living in the area were of British ancestry, and they had sons and husbands fighting in Asia. Suddenly, the man who was the guardian, the man who was in charge of looking after our families, disappeared. Where was he? My father and others went to the police to report his disappearance and the fact that they had never been paid and they didn't know what they were supposed to do. The man was found in Ontario. He had assets, but they were all transferred to his wife. Nothing could be done. Some of the others at our self-supporting site eventually left for internment camps. My father and mother stubbornly stayed on along with another family and my father's parents. My father, who had been studying part-time in Vancouver to become an accountant, found work as a logger, and he was gone for most of the week. My mother did laundry in the lake across the road from where we lived, and she had to learn to bake bread and make do with whatever grew in the garden. My father used to skate across the lake to buy groceries, and in summer, he walked. And then when I was about 5, we had to move because the property we were on had been sold. We moved to a tiny village nearby where there was a school, and that's where I started school. And then when I was 8, we moved to another town closer to my mother's aunt and uncle. We were able to stay in BC, but not near the coast. In the Landscapes of Injustice book, there's a chapter called The Deliberate Killing of Home. The final chapter is called Dispossession is Permanent. Yes, dispossession is permanent. As a child, during the internment years, my memories are of a happy home life. My mother and father did a lot to protect me, to ensure that I was happy. I've been fortunate that with my parents' encouragement, I graduated from UBC with 2 degrees. I've traveled, attended, and presented at international conferences. I'm now retired and have a good career with opportunities, but I can't help but think about people like my parents, Japanese Canadians, who were forcibly removed, incarcerated, and suffered. They suffered racism, dispossession, economic losses. They suffered lost opportunities in their education, careers, and life choices. The Japanese Canadian community as a whole lost a sense of home and community. And the racism didn't end with the war ending. What is home? Home is more than your house. Home is your everyday life, school, family, friends, where you shop, and community. What's dispossession? What are the effects of dispossession? Answers: the trauma of the loss of home is generational. Dispossession is permanent. Think about it. What would life be like for you if suddenly you and your family were dispossessed of all that you had except whatever you could carry with you? Forcibly removed, incarcerated, and 7 years later, you were granted freedom, but there was almost nothing left for you. My parents were born in Canada. During the internment years, Japanese Canadians were labeled as enemy aliens. They lost their rights of citizenship. For many Japanese Canadians, being Japanese had become an embarrassment, shameful. To be Japanese, they didn't want to be seen as Japanese. Japanese Canadians tried to blend in. They tried to become white. Like so many of my generation, I remember my father saying, we need to prove that we're good Canadians. How do you do that? Get a good education and be of service to your community. Were the Japanese Canadians silent? Yes, they were silent. They were stoic. They put their heads down and worked hard. They looked after their families. They had to rebuild their lives. But many people think the Japanese Canadians just accepted life without any anger. Research has proved and uncovered many letters of protest, letters written to the custodian of enemy properties, protesting, for example, the unauthorized sale of their possessions. The promise of safekeeping by the government had been broken. I'm so proud of my father. He was one of 3 men chosen by the Japanese Canadian community to travel to Ottawa in May of 1944 to protest the broken promise. For the past years, many Japanese Canadian families had quietly been donating whatever money they could spare to send the men to the federal government in Ottawa to hold the government accountable for the promise of safekeeping. But the Japanese Canadian community lost the ensuing court case. A decision was not made until 1947, long after the properties and possessions had been sold. Plus, Japanese Canadians had to pay court costs. The Japanese Canadian community today, before the internment, many Japanese Canadians lived in close proximity to other Japanese Canadians, families, friends, cultural events and places. Suddenly they were dispossessed. They lost their homes. They were scattered around Canada. 4,000 were exiled to Japan, a place to where many had never been. Japanese Canadians worked hard. They worked hard to provide for their families, to protect and to educate their children. Japanese Canadians were resilient, determined, courageous, angry, silent, stoic, traumatized. The dispossession and the loss of Japanese Canadians' homes and communities have generational impacts that are individual and community-wide. The ensuing silence from the older generations has often resulted in the younger generations not knowing much about Japanese Canadian history. Be silent, work hard, silence. I was at a presentation a few years ago when the speaker was lamenting the disappearance of the Japanese Canadian community. My answer, we're not disappearing, we're changing. We're changing. Like so many other ethnic groups who came to live in Canada, we're changing. The first Japanese immigrant came to Canada 144 years ago. The intermarriage rate in Canada of Japanese Canadians to those who are not of Japanese heritage is over 95%. In recent times, there's been a resurgence of interest amongst our 4th and 5th generations, interest in Japanese Canadian history and their heritage in Japan. Many are beginning to ask questions, to be curious about their heritage while being proud of being Japanese Canadian. At the same time, we have many who have emigrated from Japan to Canada. They've chosen to come here to add to our Japanese Canadian community. Our community is changing, growing, and we thank those who've emigrated from Japan to Canada for adding to our community. We have a common heritage. We can continue to learn and to grow together. Together, we can help the younger generations. We can thank the older generations. Together, we can take pride in our shared Japanese history or Japanese ancestry. Together, all of us can keep the Japanese-Canadian community strong, united, and a source of pride. Thank you. Arigato.
Thanks, Vivian, for that very impassioned talk. I definitely have a lot of things to think about, and hopefully we'll have some time to discuss it at the end. Okay, so Jack, over to you.
Okay, and yeah, hopefully we can end on a little bit of happier note, because I was of a younger generation of Mary and Vivian, so my experience is a little more upbeat, and you know, I have to thank Vivian and Mary for being the older generation that took, you know, the brunt, the worst of it, so that younger generations could thrive. So I'm just going to turn off my screen and share my presentation. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, I think my story kind of picks up a little bit later, after the worst of it, and I apologize for the title of my presentation. It sounds it's a very 90s title, Nikkei by design, but it seemed to fit for some reason. So
Jack, right now I'm only seeing some flowers. Is that what you wanted to show?
yeah, are you so are you seeing a title?
I'm looking.
And then there's a part of a letter.
Yes.
Yeah, we're seeing.
The amazing thing is, so the amazing thing about this is that as well-to-do and as this person was, and the head of a successful business and had impeccable references, you know, his request to move the families to Toronto was denied. And so, you know, the second choice was to head out east, further east to Montreal. And Montreal wasn't considered, you know, obviously the first choice. It, like Toronto, was, you know, very far from the Pacific Northwest, which is a climate very familiar to Japanese Canadians. And at the time, though, Montreal was sort of welcomed Japanese Canadians with open arms, and so the decision was made to head there, and that's where we went. And my father actually got a pretty good job at a company called Eagle Toys in Montreal, and eventually he was credited with inventing the tabletop hockey game, or at least that's what I told all my friends. So that was always my story, that my dad invented the tabletop hockey game. But a few years ago, through this article, he kind of came clean that he wasn't exactly the inventor. He was hired by this company in Montreal to circumvent the Swedish copyright on the tabletop hockey game. So he actually did make a lot of improvements, and he's actually responsible for the kind of game you see today. But it's like almost, you know, he's a creative man, he's a smart man, and he's kind of like, you know, I always think of the Japanese as being people who don't actually invent things. We borrow a lot. You know, we didn't invent kanji or gyoza, or the automobile or the video camera, but we tend to improve things. We tend to improve things that are already invented, and I think that's a very Japanese thing. And so this is our family. I'm in the red circle there, obviously. My mom was horrified, not that I got hit in the face with a rock the day before the photo was taken, but that this would show up in the family photo. So that explains that gruesome little injury on the side of my face. I apologize for some of the quality of these photos when you abide by the rules of borrowing internet photographs. This is the quality that you get. But this is the Japanese-Canadian mission in Montreal, which we went to a lot in the early days, and it was a very, very small community. And there just aren't that many Japanese Catholics probably anywhere in the world, and Montreal was no different. So we were a very small group, but we did spend a lot of time here. And so this is my childhood. It's not exactly my childhood. This is the school I went to in the 70s, Roxborough Elementary School, and that is not me in the red circle. But and this may be the only time when having a token Asian is allowed or appropriate. So this person, I'm not sure who he is, but this really summarizes what my experience was growing up in Montreal in the 70s. So this is, there's obviously a big lack of diversity here. And so what you don't see here is that, so these are all English kids, and they themselves are a minority in the province. So, at that time, I think English-speaking people made up only 13% of the population of Quebec. And then, so all these people in the photo are minorities themselves. And then I'm a minority of a minority, and a visible minority. So you can only imagine that I stood out, and like this person here, he further stood out because his haircut was so bad. And the time when you really want to just fit in, you really, you can't help but sort of stick out like a sore thumb. So yeah, growing up in Quebec was not easy, and it was not easy because I was not French and I was also not white. So it's kind of like the double whammy. And so that was sort of my experience growing up. Interesting side note here is that we were looking at some of these old photographs from the 70s, and my friend's kid asked her mom why they decided to have school photo day and pajama day on the same day, which I thought was quite interesting observation. Another bad photo here, but in the late 70s, the Parti Québécois was sort of rose to power, and it was a political party that was intent to have Quebec separate from Canada. So it's kind of a politically tumultuous time. Even though the French were actually in the majority population-wise, they felt that they were actually ruled by an English minority of 13%. So there was lots of turmoil. There was the French felt that they were bullied by the English, and the Asians felt bullied by everyone. So there was a lot happening. There was a lot of anxiety. There was a lot of racism. We got called a lot of names every day and pushed around, beaten up. Nothing too serious, but when it's every day, when it's a daily occurrence, that does wear down on you. And so, yeah, that was my life, sort of just getting bullied every day. And I'm not supposed to say this, but being bullied like that every day kind of made me stronger. And I know that's not everyone's experience. It's actually a rare experience that actually makes you stronger, but it sort of did it for me. I know it's not the same experience for most other people, but it pushed me to become better and stronger. This is the Sunlight building in Montreal, and it kind of became a symbol for the move, or the end of Montreal being the financial capital of Canada. and they decided that after the Parti Québécois was elected, that they were going to move their head office to Toronto, and that started a kind of a wave of companies moving their head offices from Montreal to Toronto, and something that just continued to this day, and that became the economic downfall of Montreal, and a lot of English people followed. And so the English-speaking population in Quebec has actually been reduced quite drastically over the years since then. And we kind of followed, our family followed that and moved to Toronto in 1979. Actually, it's interesting to note that June 24th in Montreal, in Quebec, is a national holiday, and that's their big celebration. And the whole Japanese community on that day used to all travel to Ontario to have their gathering. So it was kind of the Japanese community never really totally felt welcome in Quebec, and there's still some people that remain to this day, but a lot of people left and moved to Toronto, and that's what we did in 1979. And upon moving to Toronto, and in some of my early years, we used to go to Ontario Science Centre quite a bit, and this is quite a well-known tourist attraction in Toronto. And I found out through my parents that it was designed by a Nikkei architect named Raymond Moriyama, and he was a friend of the family. They knew him growing up in Vancouver, and I think it's the first time that I actually looked at a building and sort of realized that it was architecture, and I thought, this is something that I want to do. And I also noticed that this building also somehow looked Asian. Like I could sort of see in there that there was this Asian flair. It almost had a temple-like quality to it. It's a lot more subtle than this, but the lines of the building sort of suggested, had this Asian flair about it that really interested me. And it was for the first time I actually noticed architecture, and the first time I thought, wow, like you can actually, as an architect, kind of express yourself in a building. So I was really fascinated by this, and I was determined at this point to become an architect. I've since visited this building, and they've completely destroyed it. You can see elements of the original there, but someone has taken this building and added their own, front entrance onto it. And if the first building was, elegant, like a nice piece of sashimi, I describe this as like a Big Mac just sort of stuck on the front of it. And so it kind of ruined it for me, but the original sort of always stays with me, and in when I design. In 1982, I moved on to Waterloo to start my University of Waterloo to start my planning and architecture education. And at Waterloo, I had a professor that was named Kiyobazumi. And he didn't teach architecture, but he taught about, the philosophy of design and the social aspects of design and planning. And he was quite an unusual character. He was a Nisei, and this actually is a true article, how Kiyoshi Izumi built the psych ward of the future by dropping acid. So this was something he actually did. He experimented in 1960s Saskatchewan, designing psychiatric wards while under the influence of LSD. And while some of this type of research may be questionable now, it really stuck with me that with Raymond Moriyama was really an inspiration in a about the physical aspects of design. And Kiyozumi really taught me the importance of the psychology of spaces and the social aspects of design. So in Winnipeg in 1986, I moved out to live with my brother and continue my architectural education. And I sort of am just going to skip that, even though it was an interesting time in my life. The majority of my profession has been spent in Yukon, which I moved to in 1991. I thoroughly planned to move out west because I was thrilled by the idea of moving back to the West Coast, because I was gradually doing that anyways. I always thought that I should be a West Coast resident, because that was what history should have had allowed me to do, but it didn't. But I was always intent on making my way out west. I'm still mad at my grandfather for moving from Hawaii when he did, because I also thought I should be born as a Hawaiian. But in 1991, I moved to the Yukon, and I've been there ever since. And so the Yukon is this pretty magical place with spectacular landscapes and vistas and a really good, interesting sort of human and nature integration, which is a real motivator for design. So I mean, I've been here for 30 years because I've loved it so much. And you know, to this day, when I do buildings, this one's an emergency response center. This, you know, I still maybe a little bit haunted by some of the first images I saw of Raymond Moriyama's building and the sort of Asian-inspired roof lines. And I'm not trying to copy them, but somehow I'm compelled to sort of study that idea, you know, the roof covering, the sort of attachment to the sky, and also some of the kind of the bulky detailing that sort of comes with some of that original Moriyama building. And you know, I like to kind of do these buildings in a way that you know, it's like kind of strong, you know, with strong lines and simple detailing, simple shapes, platonic shapes. And even though some of these buildings may be harsh, like this building here, I mean, it's a correctional center, a living unit for women in a correctional environment. I mean, there's still this ability to make it kind of soft and humble and warming. And so, you know, there are some hardened individuals that were living in this space, and hopefully the architecture could sort of soothe some of those hard edges. And that's what this was about, is kind of soothing some of those hard edges. And that's what we tried to do here and incorporate with the landscape and the landforms. And so I've always, you know, always been fascinated with Japan, and this is my kid, and this is my son, and he, in his first 19 years, I took him to Japan 3 times, and we both loved it, and I definitely developed a real attachment, affinity to the Japanese culture. And even though he recently, this is my son's show, he kind of developed an anxiety towards traveling, he still is willing to go to Japan at the drop of a hat. It's the only place he'll go in the world, is Japan. About 3 years ago, I flew 12 people in our office to Japan, because I wanted to show them, you know, the Japanese building culture, and also take them to a cat cafe. And, you know, the Japanese architects are world famous for their architecture, and they're admired throughout the world. Actually, in the, I don't know if you can see this on your screen, but down here in the right-hand corner, there's me and my business partner buying beer from a vending machine in the street. So this is something, this is one of our big favorite things to do in Japan. So look at architecture and buy beer from a vending machine. This is a building by Kengo Kuma, which some of you living in Tokyo might recognize. But yeah, I really wanted my staff to sort of, you know, key in on some of the Japanese eye for detailing and you know, detailing of and presentation of you know, common everyday objects. You know, and they're just how they deal with construction and buildings and the landscape and incorporating the two together. They've had a lot longer time to deal with landscape and architecture, and so there's a maturity there that I thought was really important for my staff to see. This is my business partner and his daughter, and this kind of shows how, you know, it's really struck me that a lot of Japanese outdoor spaces look better than our indoor spaces, which you know, just amazes me every time I'm there. But most of all, it was like a good opportunity for my staff to sort of finally stand out in the crowd, like I had always done all my life. Finally, I was the guy that fit in, and they stood out. So it was kind of an interesting experience for all of us. And so I haven't. There's been no attempt to sort of you know, mimic a Japanese style or anything like that. But I think that somehow inside me there's this desire to be sort of minimal and you know, to do some kind of quiet design. And some people may not think this is a quiet design, but I think it's I try to make subtle moves with architecture and use color, you know, to impact the space. You know, this turn a scary, dark, ugly parking area into something that is a little bit warmer, brighter, and more secure, have a more secure feeling to it. So I try to incorporate, you know, clean lines and you know, some elements of maybe approachability. You know, and it's a correctional facility, another correctional facility that we did with a firm from Vancouver, and you know, to try to create these rounded edges, rounded corners, and to, you know, again, just to soften some edges in what is a correctional environment for some pretty hardened people. This is a sun shading device that keeps some of the more damaging UV rays off of wood siding and from the interior. Again, we try to do things, you know, passive and with subtlety and kind of minimal in a way, especially in terms of composition of materials. And again, trying to do, you know, quite simple moves, and then using color where it's needed. This is in a vocational environment for technology students, and the red zone that was there to tell remind students that this is where they have to put on their PPE. So PPE goes on here before they go through the doors. So again, I'd like to think that our designs are quite minimal and try to use a sense of scale, use a sense of human scale and materials and color in a simple way, much the same way as a lot of important Japanese architects do. This is a house, and again, you know, simple, clean lines, platonic forms. Try not to involve too much excess, although a lot of people would say that the house itself is excessive. The architecture is, I think, kind of restrained. So again, this is, you know, this is a house I did for a couple, and this is, you know, simple forms sitting in the landscape, framing oneself against nature. And I think, you know, I don't think there's an overt Japanese design sense, but I just think my preference for restraint and subtlety and minimalism sort of is a Japanese trait in character, and does come through in a lot of Japanese architecture. So the final move, I haven't moved actually to Vancouver 2019, but I actually did buy a place there with the intent to someday move there, and I do visit Vancouver quite often. So who knows if this will be the thing that finally gets me back to where I felt I should have been all along, but only time will tell. This is my final slide, and I actually took this 1 week ago. This is my childhood home in Montreal. And actually, so after I took this photo, this is, yeah, just 1 week ago that the homeowner came out and just very, very upset and waving her arms, yelling at me in French, but why are you taking photos of my house, and quite angry. So luckily I still have a pretty good command of French, and I had two girlfriends from Quebec, so that helps. And so luckily she was really hot, came out really hot and just yelling and waving her arms and yelling at me in French. And so luckily I was able to explain in French that you know, that I was my parents had this house built, and you know, this is my family home, you know, for 19 years or 16 years. And so, you know, she immediately did a 180, immediately calmed down, and we had a friendly conversation in French, which was, you know, turned out kind of nice. But you know, I couldn't help but feeling, wow, this is supposed to be my homecoming, and it turns into an event like this where someone immediately, I don't know, becomes hostile at the sight of someone just taking a photo, obviously on the street, on public property. So it's, I was, you know, I couldn't help but thinking to myself, maybe this is why I left Quebec, and maybe nothing's changed. But I think the nice thing to come out of it, this story, is that, you know, that through dialogue we were able to manage what started out as a hostile situation, and just through talking everything got turned around. So maybe what turned out as an unpleasant event did turn out okay in the end, and you know, I'm feeling okay about it. And I mean, it is what it is, and actually, yeah, I think dialogue is the answer. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack, for your presentation. I definitely have a lot of questions, and I'd like to talk more about architecture, but I guess today's not the time for that. But I know that we're right at 7:30 now in Calgary, and 6:30 in Whitehorse. I'd like to open up the questions to the audience, as in particular the Japanese students, because this is a program that we designed for our Japanese university students. So I'd like to take some questions if there are any from the students, and then we'll open it up to everyone if there are any from the audience as well. 日本語でも大丈夫なので you can also ask in Japanese. We have a couple of translators in the chat room who could help you translate your questions. Or if Mary, Vivian, and Jack, if you guys can answer in Japanese, you're also free to do so as well. 何かありますか? Maybe just to get it started, I have one question in particular for maybe Vivian and Mary, because both of you talked about dispossession and the internment. I'm wondering what is your feeling now looking back? I mean, I could imagine that there's a lot of frustration and maybe anger and maybe resentment towards the government for what they had done. What do you feel has changed in your feeling towards Canada in the last 50 years since the war? And what is your relationship with your homeland now, your roots in terms of Japan? Maybe Mary, could you?
My father and mother always stressed forgiveness, and we were able to get over the anger that way. Like they always felt like Nelson Mandela, who said, forgiveness liberates the soul. And the word bitterness was never part of my parents' vocabulary. And I think by forgiving, they were able to move forward. Because I think if you're angry and bitter, you just don't move forward. You just stay and wallow in that bitterness and anger. And for me, Canada is my home. It was, you know, we had terrible experiences. However, we succeeded regardless of the hardships that we got through, and to the challenges of going through the cruel journey that we had to take. We learned a lot. We learned to persevere, and I think we became better people too. Well, and you know, whenever I go to Japan, I never feel that I am Japanese somehow. I don't know what it is about this feeling, but for my father, whenever he went to Japan, you know, he still had this connection, really strong connection, because that's where he was born. But for me, I always felt myself as a Canadian.
It's very interesting. Last week we had the session with the academics, and someone had mentioned that as well. There was a gentleman who was a Japanese Canadian living in Japan currently, and he was saying that he felt he connected more with the white people who were living in Japan because they all felt foreign. And you know, Jack talked about blending in, I think, experience, but I think there was a feeling of being foreign as well, because there was so much unspoken culture that felt foreign. You don't behave like a Japanese unless you've been there for quite a while. So I think that's very interesting, because you say you feel foreign while you're in Japan. I think that feeling of being foreign is because you don't behave the same way, but at the same time, when I was living in Japan, same thing with Jack, is that I felt like it was the first time that I actually didn't stick out as a like a sore thumb. And it was quite interesting that I you know, looking at my foreign friends, and they were feeling that they stood out a lot. But when I was living in Japan, one aspect that was spoken a lot about was that if you look foreign in Japan, you get away with things because you're not expected to behave like a Japanese. But if you look Asian, you're expected to behave like Japanese, and you're against a more strict set of standards. Vivian, what do you think? You're muted right now.
The first part about anger, I think there's a Japanese word, shikataganai. And certainly when I was raised, it wasn't, I don't remember my parents being angry. It was a case of, we just move on. And certainly there were things that my parents did as I was growing up to show how they worked really hard to fit in. And yet at the same time, when we moved to a town where there were some Japanese Canadians, we would go to the Buddhist church for their bazaars and things like that, but we weren't Buddhist. There were times of racist incidents, but I was always shielded from it. And I think my parents, I thank my parents for providing a very positive example of how you move forward without anger. And I think that they really set a good example. You know, how can we be working to help the Japanese Canadian community to be Japanese Canadian, but yet at the same time, not be angry about things. That's not helpful. And I think at the same time, I've only been to Japan once, and it's true. It was comfortable to be in Japan, but I was uncomfortable because I really didn't know what to do. And at times I know there were expectations of me, but I didn't quite know how to act. I remember visiting a home and not realizing that the slippers for the bathroom were not to be used in the rest of the house, you know, things like that. The hard part is, I know my friends have said too, the hard part is when you're in Japan and you're a foreigner, people don't point out your mistakes or correct you in a helpful manner. So you never do learn everything. But yeah, do I identify as being Japanese? In Japan, I didn't fit in. I think I saw things through a Westerner's eyes because this is where I've always lived.
Jack, what was your experience being in Japan?
So for me, I mean, I loved every bit of it, you know, because I guess because as an architect and someone interested in design, I mean, good design is everywhere. And, you know, I didn't need to necessarily connect with people to enjoy the place. I can, I'm happy enough just walking the city streets, just looking at buildings and sidewalks and door hardware and hinges and things like that. So I guess my experience isn't predicated necessarily on connecting with people as much, but so I sort of connect with the architecture. But yeah, I've never you know, I've never had an unpleasant experience in Japan ever, and I just sort of feel totally at home there, even though I don't. My command of Japanese is not good. Actually, a lot of people in my family have never been to Japan. A lot of my siblings, and because there was something stopping them, something preventing them. There's like a block there. A lot of people. Some say they want to, you know, first be able to speak Japanese before they go. And so they, the idea is they'll learn that and then they'll go, but then, time starts running out. But it's better just to dive in and go, and it won't be perfect. You won't know, you won't have a command of Japanese, but you just have to sort of jump in feet first into the culture and then let things go from there. I mean, it's like learning any language. If you're the kind of person who wants to speak a language and is really afraid of making mistakes, you'll never be able to learn that language or speak it fluently. If you're fearful of speaking it out of making mistakes, you'll never get anywhere. So yeah, there's so many reasons that could prevent you from going to Japan as a Nisei. There's so many things, like arguments that could talk you out of it, but you just have to jump in feet first and do it.
For sure. I think language definitely helps. I think, Jack, you and I have a lot of things in common. I was also originally from Montreal, so I'm also a French speaker and then grew up in Montreal. And language definitely helps. I think that helps you to integrate, helps you to blend. I think that comes back to the topic of integration, right? I think as immigrants coming to Canada, and during the time of internment and even after that, it was all about trying to integrate and to blend in and to find to belong. And I think that's very important as part of what is common between the topic that we're talking about, Japanese-Canadian Nikkei culture. It's a story of finding a home and finding a belonging, and which do we belong to. And maybe for our audience as well, Jack and I are architects, and I think the love for Japanese architecture is very particular. I think is because of the detailing, what Jack was talking about in terms of the Japanese attention to detail, and that's not just in architecture. I think I know that at the University of Calgary every year they have a studio that takes students to Japan, not just to look at buildings, but to visit swordsmiths. How do people make knives and swords, and that attention to the material or to the detailing of everything, things that seem very, very small. Okay, so I do see a couple of questions that popped up in the chat. Maybe Yukiya, if you wanted to read them out, and maybe if you can say it in English so that our speakers can answer.
Sure. So I think the first question was for Mary and Vivian. And so the question is, the Nikkei Canadian people, as you mentioned, had lived in a very harsh condition due to the act of Canadian government at the time. So what do Nikkei people of your generation today feel about Canadian government? I mean, right now, do you still have the sort of the same distrust towards the government?
I think for me, there is no distrust. I'm Canadian. The anger is not my anger. I take my lessons from my parents, my grandparents, my siblings. I don't see anger there towards the government. However, what I do personally is I think it's really important to point out what happened to the Japanese Canadians as a part of Canadian history and to be taught to Canadians. Because so often people have this picture of the Canadian government. People from overseas quite often have a picture of the Canadians being just nice people and nothing terrible ever happened. But things have happened in Canadian history to our Aboriginal people and to Japanese Canadians, for example. I think it needs to be taught not in a moment of anger, but as this is what happened and what can happen. So it's really important today for people to hold the government accountable, to pay attention and to ensure that this type of thing never happens again. But it is part of education and Canadian history. It's not just Japanese Canadian history.
Mary, did you want to comment?
My husband and I continue to speak to the public and the school children and the university students. The reason we do this is because we would like our history to not disappear from the Canadian history books. We wanted to tell our stories because only the people who experience the journey could tell it the way it actually happened. And I always wanted to make sure that the public hears the true story, not with euphemisms to distort the journey that we had to take, and also to make sure that our history is kept alive.
Thanks, Mary. Yuki, I think there's a couple of questions about architecture. Maybe you can ask those.
Yeah, so yeah, this is a question for Jack from the chat box. And so you mentioned that you're in a way sort of inspired by buildings and scenery you see in Japan. So if you had a chance to design a building or some other things in Japan, what kind of idea do you have, or what would you like to do?
Maybe a cat cafe. No, I never thought about that. I'm not really sure. I just don't feel like I would be qualified to design anything in Japan, just because I sort of have this superficial interest in Japanese architecture, but I don't feel I would be qualified to do something there, just because you really need to have a really good handle on materials, and that's something that's really important in Japan. The Japanese architects there have a really good understanding of the materials they use, especially concrete, and wood, just this phenomenal knowledge. And so I just would never feel qualified to actually do that, but I love just admiring it, and I just love the attention to detail. So yeah, me and my business partner, we're the same way. I went to Japan once with him, and he loves detail. And we checked ourselves into the hotel, and we each went into our hotel room, and then I went and I just opened the drapes, the curtains to the hotel room, and then I noticed that the way in North America we have like one curtain rod for the drapes, for the curtains, and the curtains hang on one rod. But in Japan, well, this place anyways, maybe not everywhere, but this place had individual curtain rods, and then when they met, they kind of overlapped. And in Canada, when you have drapes, they kind of meet, and there's always a gap, and there's light that comes through. But in Japan, one passes by the other, and just creates this beautiful closure. And then I noticed this, and I thought, wow, that's smart, that's beautiful. And then there was a knock on my door, and my business partner comes over and says, "Did you see the curtain rods? Did you see the drapes? How they close?" He was so excited. And it's like, yeah, I saw it. And so it's just like this. We both in love with how the Japanese think about putting things together. And
Henry,
sorry, go ahead.
Henry, I have to leave now because I have another appointment.
Yes, I'm sorry it's going a little bit over time. So thank you, Mary. And
Okay, thank you.
Questions. Thank you, Mary. We appreciate it.
Bye.
Thank you.
Just one more thing about Japanese architecture, and I hate to bore those who don't have an interest in it, but in the public spaces, they just design things to be maintained, to be kept clean. Everything is clean in Japan, and it's because it's designed that way. It's designed to be maintained. It's designed to facilitate the cleaning process, where in North America, it's really not there's very little attention to be paid to maintenance and how things are kept up and swept and washed and cleaned. Whereas in Japan, there's just such an attention paid to that. It's beautiful.
I think Jack's being a bit humble as well. I think last week we looked at a bit of Raymond Moriyama's work actually, and Jack also talked about Raymond. Raymond actually designed the Canadian Embassy in Tokyo, and I find it amazing. I mean, if there's an opportunity to work on a project that introduces Canadian culture in Japan, you know, I would love to work with Jack on that project. What's the next question?
Yeah, there is another question for Jack. So until you became interested in architecture, what are other things you wanted to pursue? I think Henry mentioned that you wanted to become a policeman.
Yeah, well, that was in my bio, and it is true. Like, I spent my entire childhood drawing pictures of policemen. I don't know. I really was interested in authority or something, but I did spend a lot of my time just dreaming of being a policeman until one day, I actually made all these drawings, and I actually made books about being a policeman. And then one day, my mother noticed that one of the drawings that I did was a design for a police station, some architectural drawings, and that was only when I was about 11 years old. So I think that's when maybe I realized that I was more destined to become an architect than a policeman.
Thanks, Jack. So we have one more question, and maybe we'll just close after this one. Yukiya, can you read that, Ludi's question?
Okay, yeah, I'll just, so this is in English, so I'll just read it out loud. Thank you very much for sharing your difficult and impressive stories. I can't imagine what your family and Japanese-Canadian went through. I really appreciate what you shared and feel very grateful to be here in Canada as a Japanese and be able to join this diverse culture that you have created with painful experiences. I would like to say thank you for this great opportunity. How could we learn more about the true history of Canada? Any books you recommend?
Maybe Vivian, did you have any?
I think one of the books that's a real classic is written by Roy Mickey. I think it's called Redress. Roy Mickey and his brother Arthur Mickey were instrumental in bringing about redress, and that's included in the book. But yes, Roy Mickey's book, I think it's called Redress. It's excellent. The other thing you might want to do if you're interested in learning more about Japanese-Canadian history, part of what I have done for the past 7 years is I was the Community Council Chair, the Advisory Committee of Japanese Canadians to a 7-year research project called Landscapes of Injustice. And it was an in-depth look at the dispossession of Japanese Canadians. So certainly go to the Landscapes of Injustice site. It's just landscapesofinjustice.ca. And there you will find all kinds of videos, books, stories, and there's a lot of the work of the researchers on there. And there is an actual book called, I just happen to have it here. It's called Landscapes of Injustice, and it's a gem. So certainly I think that would probably give you the most comprehensive look at anything to do with Japanese Canadian history.
Okay, thanks, Vivian. Okay, so we're at 8 o'clock now in Alberta. So I'd like to close the session. There's a couple of more comments here with some recommendations for references. Maybe I'll just let Vivian and Jack, if you have any final comments for our audience, and then we'll close the session. Maybe I'll start with you, Vivian, since you have your mic on right now.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and to a group of people that I've never spoken to before. There certainly is a lot of interest from non-Japanese Canadians, and so I've been speaking at at schools and different community groups, including the Rotary clubs. So certainly, I think this is an opportunity for us all to learn. And I remember a long time ago hearing from one professor at UBC, Henry Yu, and he said, when there are so many different groups who've had traumatic experiences happen, and when there's a focus on one, there's a trickle effect of that, where people all of a sudden become aware of what happened as a social justice issue. And then they begin to think of other groups. And we share, it's not just Japanese Canadians who've had problems throughout the years. I think every country, every racial group has had its issues, but we all share this sense of social justice, and we can all work together to help each other to become better. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Vivian. And Jack, over to you.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that, you know, I'm always amazed at how the older generation has dealt with this in their lives. I mean, there's just I don't think I've ever heard anybody in the older generation speak bitterly about what happened. I mean, they should be, but you know, a lot of times the younger generation is actually more angry than the people who actually went through it. It's just amazing that that there isn't more anger, or that there isn't any anger. It's the recovery has been amazing, and the Japanese community has definitely thrived over the years in spite of everything that happened. You know, one of the friends of the family, he was actually fighting for Canada. He was a soldier, and he was overseas fighting. And when he came back, he found out that his land had been confiscated and sold, and his farm. And they gave him the money that it was something like $85 that they sold his farm for, and then they deducted the legal fees, and so from that, and so, you know, as he was, you know, volunteering or sort of fighting for his country overseas, that's what happened to him, you know, and but still, he wasn't bitter about it. That land today is worth millions in Surrey, BC today, but still not bitter. It's unbelievable, but I don't know. There's this resiliency that is amazing and inspiring.
Thanks, Jack. So on that note, I'd like to thank Vivian and Jack both for your time taking the time to speak to our audience. And I think this was a great opportunity to connect with the Japanese students who are learning about global studies and what's happening here in Canada. So I hope that this also gave you a taste of what it's like to be in Canada, and also connect with you know, this common heritage of Japan and being Japanese. I think this virtual conference has been very fruitful, in a sense that we've learned a lot about our history, and I think we've had a lot of discussions around these themes of ethnicity, racism, and it's definitely something that is not erased, and we definitely still have a lot of that going on these days, especially with the recent COVID pandemic. You know, we've seen another surge of Asian hate and so on. So I think this conference has been very educational, in the sense that we need to learn about our common history so that we don't repeat it. And I think that's what we're here for. So thank you again, Vivian and Jack, for contributing to our conference. And hopefully we'll have another chance to talk more in the future. So thank you everyone for tuning in from all over the world. And we'll look forward to see you again next week for the Japanese students for a wrap-up meeting and a debrief with you all. So thank you. Good evening to everyone in Canada, and have a nice week for everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。